How you guys doing? Everybody good? Good time to be in Kentucky? You know, I didn't even know this state at all till I started doing this book. And now I kind of like know my way around. I know the 65 and all these different freeways and stuff. And been to at least the central and northern and eastern part of your state. It's been great. Thank you to Norton for the support. Thank you to the chamber for the invitation to come speak. It's, I will say, a little stunning, I guess. When I was writing Dreamland, I had a deep feeling that this book would come out and fade. Because every place I went, this was not so long ago, this was 2013, 14, you know, everybody I talked to, people, particularly families, did not want to talk about this. The obituaries for people who had died were all fabrications. Everyone wanted to hide it. There was this kind of almost conspiracy of silence nationwide. And I felt that if that was the case, it would be very hard to get anybody interested. Media wasn't interested. Politicians really found other things to be interested in if no one wanted to talk about this topic. And so I've been kind of stunned to watch the last 3 years since the book came out, how I've been traveling all over the country. I'm almost a barometer of where this problem is intense, and I will tell you that it's all over the country. I've spoken in Hawaii, Vermont, Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Nevada, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, it's now the deadliest drug epidemic we've ever had in this country. In 2016, more people died of drug overdoses than Americans who died in the entire Vietnam War. I think 2017, when we hear all the figures, is going to be about the same. 2018, we'll see. Hopefully not. But so today, what I wanted to do was outline for you all a few of the factors, the threads of what went into creating our country's most deadly and widespread, I would say, drug epidemic. It really, you can take this back to the 1980s. It goes about that far back, in my opinion. During those years, I'm 59. I grew up in the 70s. I watched all those great heroin movies. You guys seen French Connection, Serpico, all those great movies about heroin coming in from New York. Those are great movies. You watch them, but they're dated. That was a time when most of our heroin came through New York. It came through New York because most of it came from the Far East. It came from Turkey, came from Thailand, Afghanistan, places like that. It crossed continents, it crossed an ocean. By the time it got to an addict's arm, it was very expensive and very weak. It had been cut and cut and cut all along the way. Hence, New York was really the hub for our country for this whole thing. Then in the 1980s, all that changed. These were the years when the Colombian drug cartels were very potent. They were like an underworld FedEx. The Mexicans weren't quite there yet, but they were on their way. Those two groups essentially transformed our heroin market. They began bringing in heroin along with their other stuff, cocaine, marijuana, et cetera. And their drugs were coming from far closer, got here much, much cheaper, every year cheaper, and every year more potent. And they basically outcompeted the heroin coming from the Far East. So by the end of the 80s, we had very little heroin. And today, very little heroin comes from the Far East. Almost all our heroin comes from Mexico, from Latin America, Colombia, but really today mostly lion's share from Mexico. And this change happened by the end of the 80s, early 1990s. Nobody noticed. Nobody noticed except for the DEA, who wrote about this in their annual reports, because heroin wasn't a problem then. Nobody cared because no new heroin addicts were being created. We had crack, we had meth, we had all these other drugs to worry about. And so that was what the focus was. I don't really cared. During those years in 1980s, too, was when a drug called fentanyl became popularized. Fentanyl was actually invented by Paul Janssen Pharmaceutica in Belgium in 1960. He then went on to synthesize carfentanil. Those drugs kind of like lingered in a limbo until the 1980s when particularly at the University of Utah, a bunch of a very entrepreneurial kind of medical school there, they developed the fentanyl patch. They developed fentanyl lollipop for kids, and soon fentanyl became this really good, well-used painkiller that did not involve a plant. It's only a bunch of chemicals, and it proved itself very effective in very limited, confined uses. 1980s were also years, though, when there began, crucial to this story, a revolution, really, in pain management in America. Started first, really, by pain specialists. Young doctors got into pain management to really change things, and they began to believe, they believed, really, and they were right, that we did a poor job of treating pain. Began to make the argument, that's too bad, we shouldn't do a poor job because we have the tool with which to use it to treat pain better, but we don't use it because we're afraid, and that tool is narcotic painkillers, opioid painkillers, morphine, but then also Vicodin, Percocet, and a variety of others that I'm sure you're all aware. They were joined in all this by the pharmaceutical companies. These pain specialists were making the argument in order to get people over the hump, particularly older doctors, over the fear that their patients will become addicted to these pills. They began to make the argument these pills are virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain. Science now knows these pills are virtually non-addictive when used to treat pain, and that was not true. Science knew nothing of the kind, but these guys, they're revolutionaries. Wanted to change and want to kick down some doors. But the revolutionaries, sometimes ends justify the means, and that's what happened, I believe, in this case. They began making arguments that were not sustained by science. They were joined by the pharmaceutical companies with their major funding, influence, lobbying power. Together, they kind of formed this juggernaut. They were joined in turn by the medical institutions that began to say, yeah, we are in an epidemic of pain. We do a poor job. We need to transform how we treat it, and the main way we do that is by liberalizing and aggressively using narcotic pain pills. They began to make the argument, this was a crucial moment in this whole thing, convincing older doctors particularly, began to make the argument that pain is now the fifth vital sign. Except pain is not a vital sign. Vital sign is something you can measure objectively. Pain you cannot. And it's something that measures your life, pulse. So pain became the only vital sign. The doctors were then being pressured to batter down to zero. You batter a pulse down to zero, you're dead. But this was the one vital sign where it was a vital sign, but we wanted to get it down, wanted doctors to get it down to zero. There's a lot of pressure building on docs to do this. These were the years when they were urged, and you probably have seen this, to always ask patients constantly about their pain. You've seen those 0 to 10 pain scales. You've seen those happy face, smiley face, frowny face things with how's your pain? Well, it's this, it's that. All of this comes out in this concern for patients' pain. It turns out when you ask people constantly all across the country how much pain they're in, it turns out they'll tell you they're in a lot of pain. So all this began in the 1980s, but really got its momentum in the 1990s. It also, however, these were a crucial time because it coincided, I believe, in cultural changes in this country, where we as Americans, as a whole culture, began to believe that we're entitled to a life free of pain, that we didn't want pain, we didn't really want inconvenience, discomfort. I'm the amateur sociologist in me comes to believe that we won the Cold War. We want to kick back, we want to have a vacation for a while. Didn't want to be bothered with complication. The world was about to become a million times more complicated. We wanted to be kind of away from that. And it was this idea that we were entitled to life free of pain. The doctors felt this. They began to believe that, they began to feel that we were treating them like car mechanics, bringing them our bodies. You fix this, doc, right? And it didn't matter when we really didn't want to have any accountability in the process. When the doc says, well, part of your pain because you're overweight, because you smoke, you drink, you eat really bad food, and you get no exercise, we would say, that's tough. I don't really want to do that. You fix me. You create a miracle. Basically, that's, I think, what was happening through the 1990s. Medicine was treating us had trained us that way. There were so many blockbuster drugs that were coming out teaching us that, you can avoid all the consequences of your own poor consumer choice. You eat badly, well, there's a drug for cholesterol, high cholesterol, there's hypertension, etc. We were trained this way as a country, plus managed care was happening. Managed care, particularly for primary care docs, meant that every doctor's office became a factory, churning patients through 12, 13 minutes at a time. There's no time to really discuss deep issues of pain. Managed care meant also that you no longer had that doc from the time you were born, the time you died, the person who knew you, knew your family history. At the same time, we lose that kind of wellness focus in medicine. It's more focused on individual problems. We have a hurt shoulder. Let's see what we can do about that shoulder. You know, we don't, the annual physical, who gets those anymore? The doc, again, the family doc kind of goes away. And in turn, we created a generation of doctors who were told and pressured that this was really, they really needed to cater to the whims of the patient. The patient knew best, and the doc had better listen to them and kind of follow their rules. Excuse me. 1996 was a crucial year in all this. That was the year Purdue Pharma, famous company you've all known, well, not so famous, maybe infamous now, came out with the drug OxyContin. It was just as important when the company came out with that drug, though. 1990s, well, before that, drug sales were really going through, the way drugs were sold were going through a revolution themselves. Before that, most drug sales guys were guys. They were older guys, gray suits. Most of them had a background in pharmacy or medicine. They knew what they were selling. The doctors knew to rely on them as credible sources of information. As medicine was changing like crazy, you were relying on these guys were from the community. They were at your church. They were at the Chamber of Commerce. They were at the Kiwanis Club or the Little League. They were somebody you could rely on, and the relationships lasted for years. 1990s, all that changed. We saw a drug sales force arms race during those years. So the pharmaceutical companies began hiring more and more. We started that decade with about 30,000, 35,000 drug sales reps nationwide. By the end of the 1990s, we had 100,000 plus, 102,000 actually. It was like locusts. As one doc say, usually I'd get like a dozen visits a week. Now it's like a dozen visits a day, and I had no idea who these people were. What's more, they were all young. They're all good looking. A lot of the women now, they didn't know a thing about what they were selling, but they did know how to sell. And they figured out that you sell best to doctors by giving stuff away. You don't have to give away a lot of stuff before everybody thinks you're great, especially lunch. Bring lunch, pretty soon the staff is like, wonderful, Lisa's here again with lunch, I love her. Just buy, whatever the hell she's selling. We just love that lady. Right? But it was also trips to Scottsdale for continuing medical education. It was calendars. You don't have to give away a lot. Purdue was part of that, but not really even the biggest part. Pfizer had 12,000 sales reps by the end of that decade. Purdue had 1,000. But the thing was, Purdue was the only company that was selling narcotics, a narcotic pain pill, in this way. The other company was selling, again, Lipitor, hypertension drugs, variety of things, non-narcotics. They were selling narcotics, and they were selling it in this way as virtually non-addictive. Less than 1%, they said, of all people pain patients treated with this stuff get addicted. And they were famous. Their campaigns are now famous. In the state of Tennessee, you see a lawsuit just filed and recently made public in which they used they used the motto from the great movie Glengarry Glen Ross. Anybody seen that movie? Fantastic movie about salespeople. Al Pacino, Alec Baldwin. Always be closing. That's really for real estate in that movie, but those are used in Purdue Pharma as a way to sell doctors on OxyContin. Free coupons, savings cards, fishing hats, calendars. They had a CD called Swing in the Right Direction with OxyContin. And on the cover was an elderly couple, because they're trying to convince mostly elderly docs to get behind this new world. Elderly couple, hand in hand, madly in love, walking through the garden, just, like swinging to OxyContin. And in the back are like, Andrew's Sisters, Count Basie, Duke Ellington swing band tunes, because you're swinging to OxyContin, which is a swinging thing to swing to, I guess. I don't know. It was relentless. This promotion began and did not stop for a decade at least In fact, the Tennessee lawsuit shows that with Purdue, it never stopped. It's only until like the last year or so. And in the end, you know, marketing worked, like I say. Marketing changed, affected an entire revolution in how we treated pain in this country. Helped by us, helped by our demands. We don't want to participate in our own wellness. This is hard work. Pain management changed fundamentally, and this is very important. Pain management used to be you take one human being and you design a whole array of strategies to deal with their chronic pain. Could be acupuncture, could be job therapy, could be physical therapy, diet, swimming. It's pain. Marriage is pain, so a lot of people for their chronic pain got marital counseling, right? And all of that was reimbursed by insurance companies. As pills took over the conversation, increasingly insurance companies began to say, you know what? Why do we do that? We're not interested in that. Let's just stop. And so they stopped reimbursing. And soon doctors were faced with what they were told was a national epidemic of pain, demanding patients, lawyers suing them for not aggressively treating pain. And to address this problem, they were increasingly left with but one tool. And that tool was narcotic painkillers. But you know, we don't do that in a vacuum. We think we were. We think it was going to just happen and that was going to be it. OxyContin was a game changer in how it was promoted. First time a narcotic was promoted virtually like over-the-counter medicine in America. It was a game changer for something else as well. Before OxyContin, people would mess around with Vicodin, Percocet, Lortab, all those little things, lower dose narcotics, but they wouldn't get to a really desperate place in their addiction because those pills include acetaminophen. So by the time you get to a really, really raging, desperate addiction that might make you want to switch to heroin, which is a kind of a chemical cousin to these narcotic painkillers, you had done huge damage to your internal organs, and really people just did not do it. Just really was. So there was no bridge to heroin before OxyContin. OxyContin comes out, no abuse deterrent for 14 years of its life. People go from Vicodin, Percocet, et cetera, smallish kind of addictions that are kind of not that bad, you know, up to raging addictions now, huge numbers, 150, 200 milligrams a day. All of that prescribing that's happening now coast to coast because doctors all across the country are being pressured and bought into this. Now that's creating its own black market too. The pills on the street are selling on the street. People get cut off from their doctors at this very high, 150, 200 milligrams. The doctor freaks out, can't do it anymore. No, you're on your own. People go to the street, they're buying pills for $100 a milligram. So that's $150 a day, $200 a day, and that is not sustainable. And it's at that moment, and this began really in the late 90s, really. It's at that moment when people began to recognize and notice that change in our heroin market that took place in the 1980s I was telling you about earlier. All of a sudden, people see heroin, particularly from Mexico, cheap and every year more potent, every year cheaper, every year more potent, as this no-brainer, as I've been told, option. Where why would you buy $150 worth of pills when you can buy $40 worth of heroin and get high for the same amount of time? So increasingly, people began to switch. We would not have a heroin problem in this country were it not for OxyContin, the kind of heroin problem we have today, just so widespread. And we would not have the kind of heroin problem we have today, which is to say, as fatal as it is, were it not for the Mexican heroin coming up so cheap, so potent, and so prevalent, all across the country. Of course, famously, Ground Zero and all this was kind of Appalachia. My map of Ground Zero would be like Columbus, Cincinnati over here, eastern Kentucky, northern Kentucky, eastern Tennessee, parts of Virginia, all of West Virginia basically, and a chunk of western Pennsylvania. That very, very roughly drawn map is kind of Ground Zero. But by the time I got onto this story, it had spread far, far beyond that. It was about 2009, then really seriously about 2012, 13, 14. By the time I got on this story, it was far beyond that. It was in the wealthiest parts of America. It was the nicest middle class and upper middle class suburbs in Charlotte, big banking center, 2 sports teams, big nice new skyline. It was in Salt Lake, it was in Indianapolis, and the suburbs. All across America, the suburbs were being mightily affected. It was at that moment I began to realize it was the children of families who had benefited most from the economic expansions of the previous 20, say 30 years. It was their loved ones, their spouses and children and uncles and so on, who were getting addicted and dying from drugs used, of all things, to numb pain. Like you look at their lives, you go, what pain? Your lives are perfect. Driving through these suburbs, you think, what pain? Don't you have, perfect lives? And it was at that moment when I realized I needed to change my concept of what I was doing. I'm basically a crime reporter. That's what I've done most of my life. I love it. I thought I was writing the great American drug trafficking book. I love that kind of stuff, interview people in prison, all that. And that's certainly part of the story. But as I got into it, I began to realize, this is a deeper story. This is about something far broader and far deeper than I had originally thought. Midway through the book, I began to realize this is about who we are as Americans, what we have become as a country, seems to me. I'm just a reporter, again, but I couldn't avoid coming to certain conclusions. I believe at the root of all this is that we have spent 35 years at least in this country destroying community. We exalted the private sector, came to believe the free market was some infallible god. We chased factories out of town, destroyed small-town community banks. We began to admire wealthy business people and financiers, regardless of whether the way they made their money did anything positive, of value for our towns, our neighborhoods, our communities. Meanwhile, we laughed at government, ridiculed it as inefficient, incompetent, bumbling, wasteful, gray. Years ago, we had a president who said government is the problem. I know what he was saying. It was a nuanced thing he was saying, but again, it came to be interpreted as government should be is this thing that we should blunt, that we should push away. It was kind of to deny the very essence of the American experiment, which is that government comes from us. Now it was something to be blunted, to be starved. As I was understanding this, though, I was in the middle of a story of a drug nightmare created entirely by the private sector, primarily doctors and the pharmaceutical industry. As I was doing this story, also, I began to realize the only folks I could talk to, we're not family members, certainly. They were scared. They were embarrassed. They were stigmatized by the whole thing. It was coroners, cops, prosecutors, jailers, public health nurses, county drug counselors, and ER docs, all of whom were fighting this alone, thanklessly, sometimes under threat of lawsuit, and all of whom were drawing a government salary. In this story, all profits are private. The Sackler family owns Purdue, now wealthier than the Rockefellers, valued by Forbes at $14 billion net worth due to $35 billion worth of sales of OxyContin since the drug came out in 1996. All costs, you probably have noticed in the state, are, meanwhile, borne by the public sector, by jails, coroner's offices, public health departments, foster children services, and on like that. But as I got into this story, there were layers, and I began digging deeper, it seemed to me. It was like fascinated with the exploration. And this story goes beyond even that. This is also a time when, as Americans, it seemed to me that we began to believe in silver bullets, easy answers to very complicated, naughty adult problems, and that we didn't have to be accountable. We began to believe that instead of self-reliance, we can isolation, like everybody in his own little bubble. Accountability, again, I lived in Mexico 10 years. In Spanish, there's no term, there's no word for accountability. It's a long phrase you have to use to describe accountability. It's a beautiful American concept, accountability. That turned into tantrums. Like if people didn't do exactly what we wanted, we go to pollsters and tell them, no, we've lost faith in our American system, in our country, somehow. In politics, you see this all the time. Politics, compromise became a dirty word. Now, instead of bending to the ideas of others and trying to accommodate ideas of others, now the really noble politician is he who never changes his mind. Part of all this, I think, too, as Americans, we adopted unrealistic expectations, again, as I said, of how much pain we should be asked to tolerate. But it wasn't just lives entitled to a life free of pain, physical pain. It was now psychological pain, emotional pain. We should be allowed to do with that. We believed old rules don't apply to us. This was a fantasy. A large element of fantasy, I think, entered American life. These were years, remember this, right? When it became normal for us to believe that every baseball players were just hitting over 60 home runs every year. Happened twice in the entire history of the sport. Now, well, it's just they're better baseball players, of course. We began to believe that bundling together hundreds of thousands of poorly performing home loans and Standard & Poor's stamping that thing AAA, and that was somehow a magnificent place to park our money. And we began to believe that widespread, massive, almost indiscriminate prescribing of narcotic pain pills derived from the opium poppy would not somehow result in widespread, massive drug addiction. We want to have it all, and the pills were it. All the pain gone, none of the risk, none of the addictive risk. We were promised that by science, supposedly, by medicine. Avoidance of pain, meanwhile, morphed. We desired so much to avoid pain that morphed into kind of like a heightened hypersensitivity to offense. Now you see this on social media all the time. People wander through social media all the time looking to be offended. It's like a narcotic to be able to say, well, I'm so offended that X, Y, or Z, or whatever. It's like an entire country of wilting Scarlett O'Haras, a nation of the thin skin. Everybody wants to come on social media and say, oh, yes, I'm so sorry you've been offended. That's terrible. Oh, my God. Meanwhile, and this is crucial, we became ferocious in our attempts to keep our kids from feeling pain. Or really, it wasn't pain, it was disappointment. Consequences of failure, which is a good thing. You need to feel those consequences. We famously gave out trophies and medals to every kid on a sports team just for showing up. God forbid every kid not feel the pain of not being the most valuable player. At the same time, we developed this fear of the public sphere. We exalted the private, the solitary individual, the private wealthy individual. We began to fear the public, terrified of letting our kids go outside alone, hovering over them, right? Just like helicopters, as they say. Fearing that they would surely skin their knees. God forbid they skin their knees riding their bikes. In this country, check this out, parents have been prosecuted in this country for letting their kids go to the park alone. That is so disappointing as an American, I could tell you. The two worst words, I'm going to tell you, take out a pen. The two worst words in the English language are play date. Okay? Business meetings for 7-year-olds, what the hell's the point of that? But that is part of this story. We're just kind of panting to avoid any kind of disappointment for our children. I grew up in Southern California. My mom was from Iowa, and she came out she brought with her a farm bell, right? And I was growing up every afternoon, 6 o'clock. She'd go to this was the 1960s, long ago. Every afternoon, she'd go to the sidewalk with that farm bell, start ringing that farm bell. I could still picture her up the block going, oh, there she goes. Friends would go, hey, Sam, your mom's ringing the bell, We all knew to run home for dinner. In fact, I think pretty much every kid on the block. Oh, well, time for dinner, I guess, because his mom's running the bell. You know why she did that? Because she didn't have a clue where we were. But one place she knew we would never be is inside the house on a sunny Southern California afternoon. I go back that same street, 50 miles from where I now live, over and over, and there's nobody on that street. There's nobody at the park around the corner. It was a beautiful, large park with all the amenities you possibly need as a kid growing up. Entire generation of children, probably more than a generation, raised on terror of the outside, of hyperprotection from pain. Again, it was all part of this feeling. I began to believe it was part of this story that I was telling you. The Atlantic Monthly wrote a story that said kids who grew up in an era of hyperprotection from physical pain were now being asked to be protected, of course, from painful ideas. They go to college, they demand trigger warnings. Was a phrase I had never heard before I read that story. Trigger warning is a warning that professors are now kind of encouraged to give students in advance of a class, warning them of disturbing ideas they may encounter in the class. But you know, why the hell should you go to college? You got to be disturbed in college. That's one of the places where if you don't get disturbed in college, you are going to be one boring person. Rest of you. I went to Berkeley, greatest university in America. We got very, very disturbed. It's fine. I'm okay. I can deal. You know, we could deal. Kids could deal with it. Meanwhile, though, again, I began to see connections to this story in broad places. We act as a private consumption, the accumulation of stuff, the path to happiness. We built into our suburbs this, you know, sad, deep, drenching isolation. We call that's prosperity. That's good. We embrace technology that really connects us in beautiful, wonderful, marvelous, amazing ways, yet leaves us oftentimes ignorant of the person living across the street, right? And as a reporter, I could tell you, and I'm here to tell you, that as Americans, we have deluded ourselves into believing we are informed by 24-hour cable news. 24-hour cable news, doesn't matter the channel, it's the format that's the problem, is just like heroin. Same way that heroin addicts, when they get addicted, they all come together, little bubbles. They talk to each other they don't want to know anything about anybody else. They just want to talk to people who know dope, how to buy dope, where to buy dope, how to use dope, blah, blah, blah. It's so boring. Same way what talk radio, 24-hour cable news, all that stuff has done to our body politic, formed us into little bubbles, saying we talk to people who we agree with, we think like, we look like, and the only time we're not, we're talking to other people is when we're sniping at them on social media. You know, the result of all this, and a whole lot more that we could go on talking about for a long time, is that we wound up dangerously isolated, dangerously separate, I think, as Americans. And that's in poverty, in Appalachia, or in affluence, in Charlotte or in Salt Lake. Kids no longer play in the street. Parks are underused. We feel pain from opposing ideas. Why then do we wonder that heroin is everywhere? Seems to me our very search for painlessness, for comfort, avoiding for convenience is a big part of what led us to this. You know, in nature, nothing exists alone. That's what Rachel Carlson, the environmentalist, said. Yet in so many ways, we behaved as if we could all just exist alone, that we were entitled to exist alone. That heroin is now raging across America is perhaps final expression of that, I believe, deluded conviction. But so too is our abandonment of small American towns, the hollowing out of our economy, which is part of this epidemic as well, I think. I believe that writing about heroin is just another way of writing about America today. We destroyed, as I said earlier, so many community banks. Made banking into some sexy, high-flying, profession when it really should be grounded in our main streets, our neighborhoods, our little leagues, and our churches. Seems to me heroin is the final expression of a lot of these values that we have fostered in this country for 35 years, a final expression of our fetish for the private at the expense of the public, for isolation at the expense of community. It's a final stuff, really, for a culture convinced that consumption is the path to happiness. Heroin, you remember, turns every addict into a narcissistic, self-absorbed, solitary hyper-consumer. A life that finds opiates turns away from family, friends, community, relatives, all of that, and devotes itself entirely to self-gratification by buying and consuming one product. And that product is the drug that most makes being alone not just all right, but really preferable. Isolation is heroin's natural habitat. I believe more strongly than ever, therefore, that the antidote to heroin is not naloxone. It is community. You want to keep kids off heroin? Make sure people in your neighborhood do things outside to get together. Let kids ride their bikes. Let them skin their knees. No problem there. We got away from that. What's best about America, and I think in the process we have rid ourselves of things that are so essential to us as human beings that they literally have no price. And the result is that we have been invaded by cheap junk. Heroin is what you get when you do that. Today, supply of opiates on our street is so vast, so scarily potent, that getting into treatment can take months. Getting out is like Russian roulette. One of the most dangerous things you can do in America today is get out of treatment. Go back to where you live. Get out of jail having not used for a while. And people die all the time when they relapse on the dope that's out there on the street today. Football is now a gateway to heroin addiction in America. It's an amazing thing to say, but that's what happens when as a culture you start believing in easy answers and silver bullets to complicated problems. Amid all this, as I'm sure you're aware, fentanyl, which should have remained this kind of very good, very limited use drug, has been discovered by the underworld. Huge profit potential, enormously scary, very potent stuff. Combine that with the internet, and they have revolutionized the heroin trade. Now, it's really not heroin trade, it was fentanyl trade. Now, they're mixing fentanyl into cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine. So any drug you use, you end up possibly dying, possibly becoming an opiate addict. The good news in all this is that there is no solution. We tried, the solitary solution, the sexy solution. One pill for every human being's pain, a jail cell for every addict. Look where it got us, I think this epidemic is calling on us to understand and do a lot of things, but one of them is that we need to stop believing there's an easy way out, that old rules don't apply to us because we're Americans, and that as Americans in a democracy, we have no need for each other. No, there is no solution. There are many solutions, plural. Each part of a mosaic, kind of a community of solutions. Each is small, must be tinkered with, improved, some discarded. Each grows from immersion. But happily, none of them is sexy. Not one of them will do the trick alone. Again, as I say, most of them grow from people who are immersed in this problem. But that's how innovation happens. You guys know this in business. It's how innovation happens on the shop floor. How does that take place? Well, you get the worker, the supervisor, the foreman, the software engineer. They're all working on it, and they make incremental, small changes to how something is made or how something is delivered. I don't see why a county or a town should be any different. Seems to me that we ought to rediscover the great American self-reliance. And realize that, ironically, that self-reliance requires depending on each other to some degree, watching out for each other. But this is so exciting. This is happening in this country right now. I've been all over this country talking about this, and I've seen it in county after county. You are finding counties forming task forces, working groups, collaboratives, whatever they call them. What they're all doing, though, is bringing together new people who never would have thought they had a role in fighting a drug issue. So it's college presidents, it's PTA, it's clergy, it's coaches, certainly coaches. They're leveraging talents, they're leveraging energy, they're leveraging budgets, and it's happening quietly. People coming together, usually at the county level. It sounds so obvious, even Pollyannish kind of, doesn't it? It's easy to be cynical, to think, oh yeah, well, that kind of stuff, it can't work. So much of our world teaches us that it's wise to be cynical, that nothing can really, really be accomplished, right? But that's heroin talking right there, it seems to me. I think it's interesting that in all these groups, what you're finding is that the convener in all this is government. Not that government has all the answers. I lived in Mexico under the one-party state, the end of the one-party state in that country. I know what bad government looks like. It's folly to believe the government has all the answers, just as it's folly to believe the government is the problem. Government cannot do it without the private sector, without you all, without medical centers, clergy, schools, etc. But government is the forum through which communities come together to solve their problems. I'll end this talk by saying that I hope I don't need to convince anyone here that this is a business issue. But in the event I do, let me just say that this is a business issue because, as you know, so many people in your areas cannot pass a drug screen. So many jobs go there and therefore go begging. Investment is withheld, theft grows rampant. Municipal, county budgets have to be devoted to criminal justice instead of roads, instead of other infrastructure that might help the county progress economically. But you know, it's more than just that, seems to me. The reason there's a business issue is that because a place that's caught up in opiate addiction of any kind finds itself drenched in a kind of dismal fatalism, a kind of an inertia, a negativity that is the opposite of optimism and innovation and solutions and forward thinking. That fatalism stands in the way of bright, fresh, creative, new responses to problems of all kinds. I think it bears saying that when those same people get addicted, find a way to work their way out of addiction, it's almost as if their town or their county got an infusion of new workers. You know? It's the same bodies, just different minds. No longer stealing the hubcaps and the copper wire from the school district. They are refreshed, liberated from one of the most beastly substances known to humankind. They are energized and grateful for a second chance. So I urge you, if you have not already, to open yourselves to the idea of employing someone who is in recovery. Look beyond the gap in her resume. You're going to find it. It's going to be long. Look beyond that. Understand that if you show her some faith with accountability, like Reagan said, trust in the Russians, she may well repay it, and that will benefit you. It will not just benefit your bottom line, but also that of your street, your town, your schools, your community, in other words. And in the end, you will understand, I think, that revolutionary role that business can play, not just in helping to eradicate this epidemic, but in the reconstruction of your communities in which you live. So, if you're looking to get involved in all this in some way, please do. If you already are, I applaud you. If you're looking for a way to get involved, I say do it. Find those local groups in your county. Get to know someone you don't already know. Add your voice, your perspective, your expertise. Yes, your money. Remember, though, that this process is messy. It's a kind of half groping for answers. The entire country is groping for answers on that. I think we should revel in that. I think we should luxuriate in that. That's a wonderful thing to be able to say, that there is no silver bullet solving all our problems, that only through collaboration with each other comes innovation. Collaboration, you know, that's what America has gone too long thinking it could do without. And it has such potential when it's unleashed, particularly at the local level. All of this, though, is why I believe this epidemic is actually one of the great forces for change in America today. Because in an age characterized by the abuse of the most isolating drug humans know, we are seeing Americans coming together. It's a beautiful, invigorating, exciting thing to watch. They're breaking down those debilitating silos that have captured us all for so long, not worrying about partisan differences that paralyze our national politics. They're understanding that it's through reliance on each other, through community, which we've done so much to destroy, that we will most likely find our way out of this very dark storm. Remember, though, if you do get involved, that you really, you are fighting something that is bigger than even widespread drug addiction. You are really fighting the real scourge of isolation and fragmentation in America today. So I'd say let's be patient with each other and with elected officials too. Let's not demand miracles from them the way we demanded pain miracles from doctors who had to then give us pills. And remember that your efforts probably, very important to understand, probably your efforts will not be recognized as they should because, real change in the adult world comes piecemeal. Like on the factory floor, and piecemeal is not sexy. Doesn't make the evening news all that much. But if you do get involved in the ways I hope you will, I believe that one day your towns will thank you. Your counties will thank you. Your country will thank you. And I like to say thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We appreciate you.
Thank
we'll
you.
hope you'll stay around for a little bit of Q&A.
Sure.
Will you do that?
Happy
so
to do
you
that.
all know how to do the Slido, and I hope that we're going to see, yeah, you're doing it already. So let's look at some of these questions. Dreamland may be the most significant book I've read and should be taught in schools. In the book, you point the finger at many powerful people. Any backlash?
Well, thank you for that. That's, again, when I started the book, or when I turned it in, I told my wife, I was like running a marathon, honestly. So I kind of collapsed at the end, you know, just like, here's the book, and I fell down and kind of collapsed and didn't do anything for about a week. So it's very gratifying to see these responses, hear these responses, and I'm very happy that you feel that way. No, mainly the pharmaceutical industry has remained very, very quiet. And I believe that's a strategy on their part because they don't see how they win by being public. My feeling as a reporter is that you always talk to the media, always. It's just, maybe it's because I'm a reporter, but I believe that you don't do yourself any favors by not. But whatever the case, when I wrote the book, I wrote to Purdue, and I said, I wrote them along. It was like my one shot, so I go, well, I want to talk to this guy, and a long list of people, and a long list of topics, and they get back to me with 2 paragraphs saying, no, but here's our response, and we're against the abuse of our drugs, and we're fighting hard to prevent that, and on and on and on. And I put those 2 paragraphs, lifted them from the email, put them in the manuscript, and that was it. I have not heard, I've not been sued. I think it would be the height of insanity to sue a reporter at this moment on this topic, honestly. So, yeah, no.
Yeah. Did government play a role in the opioid epidemic, given that Medicare and Medicaid are among the primary payers for prescription opioids, and do they bear any responsibility?
Yeah, both. As I said, when I first was into this story, mostly it was government people who were fighting it all alone for years. I mean, that's who I turned to. Public health nurses, cops, prosecutors. There was nobody else you could turn to understand what was going on. On the other hand, as I say in my book, I detail very clearly in my book, in parts of southern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, Medicaid became a major way that this problem spread, because people, before that, you know, with the factories and the coal mines and everything leaving, people kind of developed, at certain segment of the economy, developed a kind of a culture of disability. Couldn't be on welfare, since welfare reform meant 5 years of welfare, but disability was open-ended and forever, and at first, when that first happened, I think the idea was, well, you get this SSI, you get this SSDI, whatever it is, you get these checks. But then when the pills come out, all of a sudden the calculus for being applying for disability changes. Now you get a Medicaid card, and that's a card where that will fill, at taxpayer expense, fill any prescription that a doctor deems you need. And these guys will go to these pill mill quacks, come away with long prescriptions for hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars worth of drugs, pills mostly, and Xanax as well, that kind of thing. And they'd go to a pharmacy, pay a $3 copay, and be on their way with a big thing. They'd use a lot of the pills, they'd sell some of it. And the expansion of the supply, particularly in those areas that I'm talking about, that ground zero area, was in some measure, it's hard to say how much, but certainly it was significant, due to Medicaid and the Medicaid insurance card. That also requires, though, the connivance of a quack pill mill doc. And as those began to decline, because you need a doctor to say, oh yes, every month you need, 150 oxy 80s, and you need 30 oxycodone 30s, and on and on and on, all that stuff. Well, now when those kind of things go away, that scam is less prevalent. But early on, several years, certainly, that was a major way in which the supply expanded, particularly in those areas where disability had become a way of kind of navigating economic decline, basically.
New approaches to treatment of addiction that involve community, faith, and friends are emerging in Appalachia and across Kentucky. Would you suggest, or what would you suggest, to amplify this approach?
I would say that maybe it's because I'm a reporter, but I believe in telling stories, and I believe it's through stories that you do a lot. You break down lots of inhibitions. You break down lots of ideas that maybe have seen their time and gone. And so I believe that telling these stories is essential. And I think, like in the media, these are kinds of stories that we need to be telling a lot of. And the more you tell those stories, you know, it's with the AIDS epidemic. Think about the AIDS epidemic, right? First, everyone was like, it's very similar. First, everyone was like, don't put my son had AIDS in the obituary. Oh my God, he died of cancer. Please, he died of cancer. And after a while, people began to understand what this was about, began to notice. It became far more prevalent, the knowledge of it, and people knew cases and became kind of personally connected to it in some way. And all of a sudden, they changed their mind. And all of a sudden, we got an investment in, and all of a sudden, AIDS really, it's still a problem. But I mean, it's certainly not. I was in San Francisco in the 1980s. I could tell you that was like almost the plague years. Scary as hell, you know. And so, it's not unlike being in eastern Kentucky or southern Ohio during the pill years, you know. And it's just, I think it's all about telling those stories. So the best I rely on always, I have a faith that when you tell stories over and over, people come to understand them.
There's been a lot of discussion in this state over the past last session of the General Assembly about medical marijuana.
Yeah.
And so that question on the screen, what role does marijuana have in this storyline? Do you think that is a solution, or is that a further problem to the problem we have?
Yeah. Well, people always come to me and they say, hey, now, Sam, you've written this book. Now do you believe in legalizing drugs? And I say, well, like, what part of the story makes you believe that legalizing drugs? This starts with legal drugs, right? What's the message here? What's the message? What's the lesson that we need to take away? First of all, humility. Don't think we know it all. We thought we knew it all, these pills, and we absolutely did not, right? But the other lesson is be careful what you make legal and at what potency. I underline that especially. Across the country, because whatever you make legal and whatever potent drug you make legal and available all across the country will have some kind of very nasty effect. Now, I would tell you this. I lived in Mexico 10 years, and I believe in marijuana legalization because I saw that the marijuana is the gateway drug for all Mexican traffickers. Chapo Guzman, you've heard of him? He was a marijuana trafficker first, okay? Then I come back to the United States, and new facts kind of adjust my opinion. I began to work on marijuana stories for the LA Times, and I began to see, man, this is, you know, I smoked marijuana in high school and junior high. I'm like, this is nothing like that. This is like LSD. This is potent marijuana, 25, 30% THC. Very, very potent stuff. And it seemed to me that at that point it was crying out, all of this stuff that I was learning cried out for legalizing marijuana because it takes the income away from the drug cartels, and forget ISIS. The most toxic influence in our hemisphere are the Mexican drug cartels. Okay, I'm here to say that. I can argue that for a long time if you like. But we also needed to take a page from Prohibition. First of all, in Prohibition, there was all this stuff that was sold called liquor. What it really was turpentine and all kinds of wood stuff that you know in Kentucky, you know this, right? To me, the counterpart in marijuana is all this hyper-potent pot that grew up in times of Prohibition. When we ended Prohibition, we did not legalize all that turpentine for commercial sale in stores and whatnot, right? We did not. And I think we need to take the same approach with marijuana. We need to be very calm and cautious and humble, above all humble. We need to legalize it because it'll allow us to more easily study the thing, but we need to keep a very strong lid on potency, regulate potency. So, I don't know, 7, 8% THC, that's pretty mild marijuana for 10 years, and we'll see, okay, what effect does 25% THC have on the 19, 21-year-old brain? None? Okay, well then we'll legalize it if we find that. I don't think we're going to find that. I think we need to take this thing very cautiously, very slowly. Don't think we know it all. And the problem is with marijuana, we've just said, well, it's just pot, dude. Well, it's not just pot anymore. You know, the question never changed. Should we legalize marijuana? Has been asked since the 1970s, as long as I've been, cognizant, basically. What has changed is the marijuana that we're talking about. It's no longer little weed that grows in the ground, and now it's grown in these like labs and hybridized and powerful steroids added to them, and it's like these mutant beasts, kind of like some sci-fi thriller. You're seeing these things oozing goo and all that stuff. That's the kind of stuff that we're thinking of legalizing for commercial. That's insane. That is insane. I wrote an op-ed on this when California was considering legalizing marijuana, which I voted against because there was no potency component to the law, and of course it won. So we'll see. But that's my feeling on all that, on marijuana. So.
Yeah. Thank you. You spoke about how the medical community had embraced pain as the fifth vital sign. So this question kind of comes from that. How do we shift culture to become more accepting of pain as a stimulus to bring about meaningful change?
Yeah, I think little by little. Now, still we are a culture that is somehow terrified of pain. You know, it kills me. My grandfather, was in Patton's Army, World War II. 11 million people joined the Army. Every American family sacrificed to beat the Nazis and the Japanese. And now we can't even get a wisdom tooth pulled without like catastrophic dosage of narcotics. So we still kind of are at that point. What's more, I would say that the other thing is this. We have still not, we need to understand one of the most important issues facing us in this topic right now, and you as a business community ought to think about the effect it has on you, is that insurance companies still do not reimburse for so many pain strategies that do not involve narcotics. And that's asking doctors to do a lot. So a person comes in on very high doses of narcotics. What does the doctor to say? I'm going to cut you off, and that person runs right to the black market. That's very dangerous. That's feeding the wrong impulses in our society. Or I continue with, your 800 milligrams a day and hope that nothing bad happens. Instead, what that doctor ought to be able to say is, I've got a whole bunch of other options, and we're going to combine them, and we're going to work together. And this is the way it's happening in some larger health systems that have the data and have the budget to be able to do this, have the people to be able to do this. But overall in our society, which doctors are still faced with a very, very difficult choice, and we want to diminish the supply of these pills, which I think is a good idea. But if we just diminish the supply, what that means is more people are going to go to the black market. You've already seen that last few years. And the reason is because doctors, I believe, do not have any other options as a class across the country in what they offer their patients. It's pills or nothing. And really, insurance companies need to be pressured, need to be pushed, need to be lobbied in legislation in whatever form it needs to take to say, no, now we're going to get back to reimbursing for acupuncture, for physical therapy, for marital counseling, for goodness sake. Because we don't get to a happy solution by just cutting down pills unless we also provide doctors some ability to say no, but. No, I won't give you any more of these, but I've got a whole bunch of other options for you. And that's where we stand right now. And it's one of the most important. As you as a chamber need to, I would say, I've talked to medical groups as well on this. I think this is such an important issue, and you need to understand how important it is and make it maybe a priority. But that's up to you.
Question about needle exchange. How do we shift? We already asked that one. It's moving on me. What is the best way to overcome resistance of local officials in rural areas for the establishment of syringe exchange programs? Yeah,
that's a really good question. All I can say is the fascinating thing about this is the change in thinking that this epidemic has enacted in red areas of the country. It's an amazing thing to watch. All of a sudden, the parts of the country that voted tough on crime, whatever that meant, for decades, all of a sudden you get a little bit of this, enough families getting addicted, and look at northern Kentucky. I know that area pretty well now. This is an area that elected Thomas Massie, biggest, libertarian congressman in the entire U.S. Congress, right? No sooner did a lot of their kids start getting addicted than what comes out of northern Kentucky? Civil commitment law, Casey's Law. Great idea, but man, talk about government overreach. Talk about the government involvement. You can lock anybody up, people who have not been convicted of any crime, just because you can show to a judge that person might be a danger to himself or to others. That came out of northern Kentucky, where Thomas Massie was also elected. I mean, it's an amazing thing. So when you have this, my feeling is I don't know how to change the mind of people out there except for that they come into personal contact with this. I would say county officials need to understand that there are no good options, right? We painted ourselves into a corner. So it does seem to me weird. When I started this story, it seemed to me like, yeah, why would government ban a drug and then provide the implements of its use? It doesn't make any logical sense, except for in a reality where if you don't do that, you're going to be facing 20-year county bills for Hep C, HIV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason for syringe exchange is not some kind of do-gooder kind of cry for the victim kind of idea. It's to prevent these very, very nasty, very expensive spread of these diseases from destroying. And talk about effect on economic development. A place that has high numbers of Hep C and HIV patients is almost crippled, it seems to me. So I don't know. I mean, my feeling is the more people see the effect of not having it, they will come to that. That idea. That not that it's a great idea. It's just that there is no other.
Right.
Well, that's the solution we've painted ourselves into. You know.
Form of harm reduction. Yeah. Have you seen any particular programs that best foster meaningful treatment, detox, and an opioid-free return to society and the workforce?
I would say that we are all, as I said, we are all kind of groping for some answer. I look at the country kind of like half blind. Everybody kind of tripping and stumbling and not really knowing how to deal with this. It's just normal. And I would say that there are some places that I would say that in Scioto County in Ohio, where I spent a lot of time, Portsmouth, Ohio, and that's kind of what I based the book on. There was a swimming pool called Dreamland in that county I wrote about. That's where I got the title for the book. They have begun that, but what also needs to happen in talking to you all is that more and more businesses need to understand the importance of, as I said in the speech, of hiring recovering addicts. If that doesn't happen, I mean, it's like almost nothing else can happen. You can't function without a job, and so many people, again, have this big gap in their resume. All I'm saying is, with the right controls in place, you can find amazing new employees, grateful, energized, ready to kind of walk through walls. People who were once strung out on the street and looking pretty nasty. And I've seen this in several places. But I do believe, again, getting back to you guys, this is a role that you have to play. You have to look at it. You have to design it. It has to be well thought out. I'm not saying just going to waltz into it blind, but nevertheless, without your participation, it's almost impossible to see how people who are addicted currently can find their way out.